Well, I'm glad to see each of you here tonight. We are going to finish this series of lessons tonight. This makes number 5, and I've got four points that I want to share with you this evening on the truth about marriage. And that's kind of been the purpose, is to look at several myths, and we've done that. We've in fact looked at 11 as we've gone through this series of lessons, and there are a lot of things that we've gone through some of these things I've even heard within the church, and that shouldn't be the case. We want to know the truth, and we want to obey the truth. And so this, like I said, this was a lecture that I delivered in Branson back in July, and a couple people requested that I put together a series of lessons. And so that's why I've done this. Let's talk tonight about the truth about marriage. Now, what I've done is, as we've gone through each of those 11 points, we've dealt with the myth and how it can manifest itself in the world, but then we looked at the biblical truth. But I've just got 4 things that I want us to think about tonight. I understand that most everybody in here's married and have been married for a long time, but I think it's good for us to remind ourselves of these things. But then we also have quite a few young people who are close to it, who are in preparation for marriage, and then we've got some even younger than that who are not close to it and are not ready for it. And so I hope that this series of lessons has been helpful to each of us. Truth number 1 that I want us to think about tonight when we think about marriage is that it's a forever arrangement. And we've talked about that throughout this series, but that's my intention of having that particular scripture reading. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And what God has joined together in that original arrangement, He says, let no man separate. God has a plan for marriage. There's no question about that. And when you look at these verses, we're going to look at, be turning to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, by the way, and so this phrase, no matter how sick, ill, or indisposed you are, you think about typical traditional wedding vows. And what is typically said in those vows? Well, in sickness and in health, richer or for poorer, better or worse. You know, whatever situation arises in life, if we have committed ourselves to each other, and more importantly, committed ourselves to God, then it doesn't matter what situation arises. We can remain faithful to one another. There is someone who will support you and love you no matter what. That's the intent for marriage. The ideal. We might use that word. God's ideal, original arrangement for marriage. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And we read this, I can't remember, the first or second lesson on this particular subject. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. And is this passage talking specifically about marriage? I don't know. But it certainly has some principles that apply. And when I read that first verse there, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor, it takes my mind back to the garden in Genesis chapter 2. Adam is created. There's no helper comparable to him. Genesis 2:18. The animals pass before him. He names them, and then God says, I'm going to make a helper comparable to you or compatible to you. And then He forms the woman. If they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falls. I mean, we understand that in a day-to-day practical sense, don't we? Falling down and getting injured, you might not be able to get back up. Well, that can happen in life, not physically, but we can fall down. And if we have a spouse who is faithful to us and faithful to God, we have someone who can help us along because we all need that. If 2 lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And so again, while that passage may not precisely be talking about marriage, there are principles that fill it, that illustrate what marriage is all about. Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, again, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Marriage is a forever arrangement. You look at divorce rates and reasons for divorce and things like this, and we understand, and I've addressed this, we understand that Scripture, Jesus Christ Himself does give us that, how would you word it, the allotment, let's say, for divorce and remarriage in Matthew chapter 19. But that's not the ideal. And that's what He says there in Matthew 19:6 and in Mark chapter 10. Whatever man has joined together, or whatever God has joined together, let not man separate. It's interesting when you break down the statistics in our culture. Anywhere from 70 to 80% of divorces, of all divorces, are instigated by the female. I don't know why that is. But there are 2 parts to this. There is a husband and a wife, and each has their own has their responsibilities to one another. And we need to understand it's a forever arrangement, particularly for our young people, something that you always need to keep in mind. I don't want to talk about them as if they're in another room. That you need to keep in mind when it comes to marriage. It's forever. That's God's intent for it. And so, don't ever forget that point. Truth number 2 about marriage, you cannot stray or get close to straying from your spouse, even if things are tough. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We've looked at this passage in a previous lesson as well, but let's look at it again. Concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. He's talking about the physical, obviously, relationship between a man and a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and every woman have her own husband. As I've said throughout this series of lessons and in other lessons, there is one place for the physical union between a man and a woman. And it's not in dating, it's not in engagement, it's only in the marriage union. That's the way God has designed the sexual relationship between men and women. And we need to teach that. Our Bible class teachers need to talk about those things when they come up. If you're going through a book of a Bible and that subject comes up, you don't avoid that because it makes you feel uncomfortable, teacher. You teach your kids the truth. You address the subject because it needs to be addressed. The Bible addresses it many times, Old Testament and New Testament. If you want to sit down and read a good book on the marriage relationship, read the Song of Solomon. I've sat and listened to lecturers on that, tried to explain away the meaning of it by saying, well, it doesn't really have to do with marriage, it has to do with the relationship between Christ and His church. No, it doesn't. Song of Solomon is not about Christ and His church. It's about a husband and wife. And that's a good book that talks to you about that intimate relationship. Don't stray. Truth number 3, marriage doesn't solve all of your problems. And think about some biblical examples. Be turning to 1 Kings chapter 21. I think that's a great example. We'll look at that in a second. But think about Abraham and Sarah. All right, we're introduced to them at the end of Genesis chapter 11. And right off the bat, the first thing that we are told is that Sarai, cannot have children. And yet, God, in the very next chapter, within a few verses of the end of Genesis chapter 11, God says, Abram, you're going to become a great nation. And from your seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Well, how's that possible? His wife can't have children. So what did they do in Genesis chapter 16? They tried to help God out. It's not God's plan. You get to Genesis chapter 21, God says at this time next year, Sarah's going to have a son. Genesis chapter 22, Genesis chapter 21, Isaac is born, according to the promise of God. Ahab and Jezebel, the king of northern Israel, not a good man. You can read his account in Kings, his conduct, I guess you could use the word leadership, but not a good individual. But look at the biblical text says about him. Talking about marriage isn't going to solve all of your problems. One way I heard a lecturer talking about marriage, particularly the woman's role, and I was talking to someone about this the other night. One thing that women do for men is like the women domesticate the men. They help them grow up. They help them mature. And I think that's part of God's plan. Men and women are totally different, wired differently. And many times a woman makes a man better. But look at 1 Kings 21:25. There was none like unto Ahab, who did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. He was bad enough, but then they got together somehow, and it got even worse. He did very abominably in following idols, according to all the things, as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. And again, there are other things prior to 1 Kings 21 that tell us this. Of course, she has the prophets of the Lord persecuted, doesn't she? Killed, in fact. Elijah the prophet runs for his life in 1 Kings chapter 19 because after Elijah defeats the prophets of Baal, the 450 prophets of Baal, and then the 400 prophets of Jezebel, she says, you're going to be like one of them tomorrow. This is a wicked woman. And Ahab being who he was, it was a rather toxic mixture, let's say. What about a person who's in the scenario of a Christian married to a non-Christian? Well, the Bible addresses that. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, talks about a Christian woman who's married to a non-believer. It's not a sin. We've talked about that. But here's how you conduct yourself in that situation. Here's how you live. Here's how you dress. Here's how you speak. You do all of these things. And then to the husband, Peter says, verse 7, here's how you behave. Dwell with your wife according to knowledge. Marriage doesn't solve all of your problems as an individual. So that's something to keep in mind. Number 4, I thought about how to word this one. You chose each other. Talking about it's a forever arrangement, that first point. Well, you chose each other. Ladies, he asked and you said yes. You agreed to this. And so it's going to take some work. This is the only family member you'll get to choose. I typed that out and I had everything printed out and I had my PowerPoint ready. And I thought, well, that's not exactly true. But anyway, this is the only family member you'll get to choose. You're born with the rest of your family. One thing that entered my mind, of course, was the process of adoption. But generally speaking, this is the only family member you will get to choose. And so, what is the advice for that? Well, choose wisely. Choose wisely. Here's where I want to close on tonight. Here's a bit of advice. Generally speaking, always remember the beginning. Be taking your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. I looked at those 4 points that I had, and I thought, well, I kind of want to round this out and have something, I guess you might say, positive to end with. There's no doubt that there are plenty of problems and challenges and difficulties that come in marriage, some internal, some external. And so it's good to have someone that you can count on. And again, that's your Ecclesiastes chapter 4 passage. These two together are better than one. Why did you choose the person you chose? For those of you who are married, why did you choose that person, however many years ago? Don't forget that. Time can go by and that might be able to be easy to forget, particularly in difficult times. I've said throughout this series of lessons, you may not always like each other all the time or agree on everything all the time. But remember the beginning. Why did you choose this person? You made a decision, and as we say, you made your bed, now you have to lie in it. But I want you to look at a passage that made me think of this particular point. It's Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 32. The Hebrews were going through a difficult time, as marriages will do, ups and downs, challenges, difficulties. And what the author does as he begins closing the book here at the latter half of chapter 10, he says, because these Christians are in danger of leaving the faith, turning away, and he says, well, you need to call to remembrance the former days, in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great fight of affliction, partly while you were made a gazing stock, both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly while you became companions of those who were so you were being persecuted, and you were in the company of others who were being persecuted. You had compassion on me in my bonds, verse 34. Therefore, verse 35, do not cast away your confidence, which has great recompense of reward. But the idea is there in verse 32. Remember the beginning. You think about when you first obeyed the gospel, that's what he's talking about contextually. And the excitement that was there, the joy that was there. I think of Acts chapter 8 when the Ethiopian eunuch was baptized. Philip was taken away, and he was found later in Ashdod, but it says that the eunuch went on his way rejoicing. And that should be a real part of your Christian life and your obedience to the gospel. But that can die out over time, can it? That can fizzle out. How many Christians do you know, or how many people do you know became Christians and started off, as we say, on fire, excited, and then 2, 3, 4 years down the road, they were sporadic at best in their attendance, and they weren't doing anything else. It was just, and then they're gone. And you can't reach them, and they won't return your calls, and all of this happens. Well, the author's advice here is, remember the beginning. And I thought that's pretty sound advice when it comes to marriage. Why did you choose this person to commit the rest of your life to? What was it that drew you to them? Don't forget those kinds of things. I mentioned a verse that is from one side of the coin, as we say, in Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 22. He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Well, that's a man writing that. A woman could write that same thing. She who finds a husband finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Marriage is a privilege. Marriage is a blessing. It is of divine origin, and we need to know the truth on it. We don't need to be naive about it. That, again, I guess I'd be more addressing the young people here who are not yet married, that everything's going to be perfect. I'm going to find the person that's perfect, and everything's always going to be great. Well, that's not always true. And that shouldn't scare you from marriage or anything like that, but relationships are difficult. Relationships take work and growth and time, and, well, that's what marriage does for you. And so think about the privilege it is that we have, that was given to us by God from the very beginning for our good. Because that's what the text says, isn't it? It's not good that man should be alone. Well, what does that imply? Well, it's good for him to have somebody. And so marriage is a good privilege that we have from God himself. Are you married to Christ? This is where we'll close tonight. Have you obeyed the gospel? If you have not obeyed the gospel, you are not yet in a relationship with Jesus Christ. You are not in a relationship with God. And until you submit your will to God's, you are outside of Christ. And we want to encourage you to become a Christian tonight. Christians in Romans chapter 7 and verse 3, we are told, are those who are married to Christ. Married from him who was raised from the dead, is what it says. Maybe you're here tonight and you had a beginning. You started out your walk with Christ. But as the Hebrews were in danger of doing, have you remained faithful to him? If not, you need to come back to him. Jesus only has one bride, and it's his church. You cannot separate yourself from the bride of Christ and remain faithful to the husband. You've got to stay with Christ and his church. If you need to come back tonight, we want to encourage you to do that. If there's any need to respond, let's do it right now as we stand and sing.